The first ring. It started on a quiet, uneventful night. Daniel sat alone in his apartment, mindlessly scrolling through his phone when his landline rang. It was strange. No one ever called his landline anymore. He hesitated before answering. "Hello," he said, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. For a moment there was silence. Then a faint static crackled on the other end. "Daniel," a voice whispered. It was distant, distorted, and yet familiar. A chill ran down his spine. "Who is this? Help me. I don't have much time." The voice sounded desperate, pained, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the call ended. Daniel stared at the receiver, his hands trembling. The voice, it sounded like his sister, Emily. But that was impossible. Emily had been dead for 3 years. The past comes knocking. Daniel had never truly recovered from Emily's death. She had gone missing one night, and after weeks of searching, the police found her body in an abandoned house miles away. Her killer was never caught. The phone call sent a shockwave through him. He convinced himself it was a prank, but deep down, a sickening feeling told him otherwise. He checked his caller ID. No number was displayed. It simply read, "Unknown caller." He barely slept that night, haunted by the whisper of his sister's voice. The next night, the phone rang again. Messages from beyond. Daniel snatched the phone up the moment it rang. "Who are you?" he demanded. "They won't let me go," the voice whimpered. "Daniel, please, you have to find me." His breath caught in his throat. "Find you? Emily, where are you?" Static filled the line, and then a faint, distorted whisper. "The house where they left me. It's not over." The call ended. Heart pounding, Daniel knew he had no choice. He had to return to the abandoned house where Emily's body was found. The House of Shadows. The house stood at the edge of town, long forgotten and decaying. The police had sealed it off, but Daniel pried open a loose board and stepped inside. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air smelled of rot and neglect. He followed the path to the basement, where Emily's body had been discovered. The room was colder than the rest of the house. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Then his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Behind you." He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The truth revealed. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting shadows along the walls. That's when he saw it, scratch marks along the basement door. Deep, frantic, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. A sudden gust of air blew past him, carrying a whisper. "He's still here." Daniel turned toward the door at the end of the basement. He pushed it open, revealing a small, hidden room. Inside, he found an old, rusted phone sitting on a wooden table. It began to ring. With shaking hands, he picked it up. "Daniel," the voice came again, more distinct this time. "He's coming. Run." A loud creak echoed behind him. The silent watcher. Daniel turned slowly. In the dim light, he saw a figure standing at the basement entrance. Tall, motionless, its face obscured by shadow. The figure took a step forward. Daniel bolted, dashing past the entity, up the stairs and out of the house. He ran until his lungs burned, not stopping until he was safely inside his car. As he sat behind the wheel, gasping for breath, his phone rang again. This time, the screen displayed a name, Emily. Hands trembling, he answered. "He knows you were there," Emily's voice whispered. "He won't stop now." The call cut off. In the rearview mirror, Daniel saw something standing behind his car. The phone rang again, and this time he knew he shouldn't answer. The never-ending call. Days passed, but Daniel never felt safe. The calls didn't stop. They came at all hours, each one filled with static, whispers, and warnings. He tried to block the number. It didn't work. He changed his phone. The calls continued. Then one night, Daniel woke up to find his phone lying on his chest. Even though he hadn't placed it there, the screen was on, displaying an active call. It had been going for hours, and the only thing he could hear was breathing. The mark of the unknown. Strange occurrences began happening in his apartment. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open without warning, and at night he felt an unbearable pressure on his chest, as if someone was sitting on him. One morning, he noticed something etched into his bedroom mirror. He is watching. Terrified, Daniel grabbed his phone and tried to call for help, but there was no dial tone. Instead, a familiar whisper answered, "You let him in." The final warning. Daniel knew he had to put an end to this. He visited an old psychic who specialized in the paranormal. The woman took one look at him and paled. "You answered the call, didn't you?" He nodded. "That wasn't your sister," she whispered. "That was him. And now he has your name." Daniel's blood ran cold. "There's only one way to break the connection," she continued. "You have to go back to where it all started and destroy the phone." The forgotten victims. Determined to find the truth, Daniel combed through missing persons reports and police archives. At first, it seemed like an impossible task, but then he found something chilling, a pattern. Every 5 years, someone in the town had disappeared after receiving strange phone calls. The details were eerily similar: static-filled voices, desperate pleas, and an unknown number that could never be traced. One particular case stood out: a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who vanished 10 years ago under circumstances identical to his own. Her last recorded words to a friend were, "He's watching me. I can't escape." Daniel's stomach twisted. If history was repeating itself, then he was next. He had to act fast. He needed to find out who or what was behind these calls before it was too late. A police officer, retired now, had worked on one of the cases. Daniel tracked him down and begged for information. The officer was hesitant, but after some persuasion, he finally spoke. "You're dealing with something you can't fight," the old man warned. "Those calls, they aren't just voices. They're invitations, and if you answer too many times, you don't come back." A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The officer handed him a faded file filled with disturbing notes about symbols, phone records, and something called the echo caller. "What's the echo caller?" Daniel asked. The officer sighed. "Some believe it's an entity, a presence that latches onto the sorrow of the living, calling them until they cross into its world. Once you step in, there's no way out." The last call. Daniel returned to the abandoned house one last time. He found the old phone in the basement, exactly where he had left it. As he picked it up, it rang one final time. "Daniel," the voice whispered. Summoning every ounce of courage, he raised a hammer and smashed the phone to pieces. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shifted, the shadows deepened, and an inhuman scream filled the room. Daniel barely escaped with his life. When he returned home, his phone lay silent. The calls had stopped. But as he closed his eyes that night, a familiar ring echoed in his dreams. The nightmare was far from over. The unfinished business. Daniel thought it was over, but when he woke up, the landline was back, perfectly intact, as if he had never destroyed it. And it was ringing. Thank you guys for watching. If you want more videos like this, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video.